Welcome to the deep dive. You know that feeling, don't you? That persistent, nagging intuition that something fundamental is just, well, off in the world around us.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the political discourse. It feels less about, I don't know, genuine problem solving and more like a kind of performative art sometimes.
hmm Or the cultural narratives that seem to sort of contradict the foundational stories maybe you grew up with.
Exactly. Or even some of the things coming out of our most esteemed academic institutions that just leave you scratching your head, wondering if common sense has simply gone out the window.
It's that scattered set of frustrations, isn't it? That sense of a puzzle with missing pieces. And it often coalesces into a singular, sometimes pretty disturbing diagnosis.
And that's exactly what we're plunging into today, this
Yeah.
idea that there's a diagnosis for all
Yeah.
these scattered feelings.
Right. Our central premise, as the source material we're looking at describes it, is that there's a creeping systematic subversion that has taken hold of our most important institutions.
Okay, a subversion.
Yeah. And the primary symptom of this subversion, the real core issue at play, is the deliberate, almost theological replacement of merit with identity.
Merit with identity. Okay, so the core insight here isn't just about like partisan squabbles or fleeting political trends, right? It's deeper than that.
Much deeper.
It's about recognizing that if we're constantly battling symptoms, maybe we're missing the root cause. This source really tries to zero in on that root, this fundamental redefinition of what's truly valued.
Exactly. And the source is quite clear. This isn't framed as a partisan complaint. It's presented as a systems-level observation, a kind of recurring pathology.
A pathology, like an illness in the system.
Sort of, yeah. And the source points out it's visible, supposedly everywhere, from the very halls of government to, the grand cinematic universes we consume.
Like Star Wars, which we'll get into.
Definitely. And even, it argues, within the hallowed, ivied walls of the Academy. So our mission today is to really explore this theory, drawing insights from foundational myths like the Star Wars saga.
Which the source uses heavily.
It does. And then extending that analysis to the very real-world institutions the source highlights. We're basically unpacking William L. Weaver's perspective from his article, The Unbecoming.
Okay, so understanding this shift, this merit versus identity thing, why is that important for, for you listening?
Well, the argument is that understanding this fundamental shift is absolutely crucial for anyone who really seeks to be truly well-informed, to make sense of the complex dynamics playing out.
It's like getting a map for confusing territory.
Kind of. It's about recognizing how our stories, the narratives we tell ourselves, from blockbuster films to national histories, how they reflect and ultimately shape our deepest truths, and by extension, our societal values.
So it's a deep dive into the very fabric of what we believe about success, worth, and progress itself.
Precise.
Okay, let's unpack this core diagnosis then. The source uses some pretty strong language right off the bat. It calls it a disturbing diagnosis and a creeping systematic subversion. What does that really mean when it comes to replacing merit with identity? And I guess what makes it so disturbing?
Well, the article defines this disturbing diagnosis as a systematic subversion, where the bedrock principle of merit is being consciously, almost deliberately, replaced by identity.
Okay, let's break that down. Merit.
Merit traditionally refers to achievement, right? Skill, effort, competence, basically what you do, what you earn, and what you can demonstrate.
Like the engineer building the bridge based on qualifications.
Exactly. Or a doctor chosen for their diagnostic accuracy, their surgical skill. That's merit. It's about proving capability.
And identity. How does the source define that in this specific contrast?
Identity, in this specific context, isn't about personal identity in the broad sense. It refers more to inherent group affiliation, things like race, gender, or other demographic categories. It's about what you are, perhaps by birth or group association, rather than what you've achieved or demonstrated.
So doing versus being, in a way.
That's a succinct way to put it, yeah. And the source really insists this isn't just, politics as usual, Republicans versus Democrats or whatever. It's framed as a systems-level observation of a recurring pathology.
There's that word again, pathology.
Yeah, deep-seated illness affecting the very way our systems operate. And this pathology, or systemic illness, is visible, the source argues, across all these diverse institutions: government, movies, academia.
So it's not about who's in charge, but how the system itself values things, how it allocates opportunity.
That's the argument. It's about how power, value, and opportunity are being defined and allocated at a really fundamental level. And it's disturbing, the source suggests, because it implies a deliberate undermining of the mechanisms that have historically allowed societies to, well, function effectively and individuals to flourish based on their capabilities.
Okay, that makes sense why disturbing is used. It's a fundamental challenge. The source also talks about grand dereliction. What does that imply? It sounds serious.
It is serious language. It's described as a conscious unlearning of the principles that built Western civilization.
Conscious unlearning, like on purpose.
That's the implication. Think of it not as just, accidentally forgetting something, but as a deliberate abandonment of foundational values.
Which values are we talking about here?
Things like objective truth, individual achievement through effort, the ideal of universal justice applied impartially, excellence as something to strive for. The source suggests these core principles are being actively discarded or eroded or radically reinterpreted.
And the consequence.
Well, the author's assertion is stark. It's that in this quest for what's framed as a new kind of justice, this shift, paradoxically, threatens to destroy the very foundations of justice itself.
Wow. How does replacing merit with identity threaten justice itself? That seems like a leap.
The inherent danger, as the source presents it, is this. By replacing objective, ideally measurable standards of merit with subjective, often immutable categories of identity, we erode the very framework that allows for fair and impartial judgment.
Because justice needs impartiality.
Traditionally, yes.
Yeah.
Justice relies on universal principles, an unbiased application of rules. Right.
Yeah.
If competence, innovation, genuine contribution becomes secondary to who one is rather than what one can do or has done, then the system becomes less about what's right or effective.
And more about
Navigating an ever-shifting landscape of group affiliations and political considerations tied to those groups. This dereliction points to a failure of leadership, of stewardship within these institutions to uphold their foundational duties.
So if an institution is meant to foster excellence, say in science, but it starts prioritizing identity instead.
Then it's abandoning its core mission, according to this view. The stakes are presented as immense. A potential decline in quality and trust across the board, less competent institutions, less effective governance, maybe a diminished capacity for society to solve complex problems through objective reasoning and demonstrable ability. It's seen as a foundational crack.
Okay, that clarifies the dereliction part. It's about abandoning the core purpose. What's really fascinating, though, is how the source immediately turns to our modern myths to illustrate this. It zeroes in on Star Wars, calling it a foundational myth, articulating the eternal battle between good and evil. Why start there? Why a galaxy far, far away to understand us?
Well, because, as the source puts it, it is in our stories that we reveal our deepest truths. Star Wars isn't just, spaceships and laser swords for many people. For generations, it's served as this cultural touchstone. It simplifies really complex moral questions into these easily digestible archetypal narratives. The original vision, George Lucas's vision, was pretty clear and profound in articulating this eternal battle.
Good versus evil. The Jedi versus the Sith.
Exactly. Good, embodied by the Jedi at their best, seeks freedom of choice, lending wisdom and counsel. They represent the pursuit of knowledge, balance, allowing individuals to make their own decisions within a moral framework, understanding the Force, using it for defense, not attack.
And evil, the Sith.
Evil, the Sith, seeks only to dominate and control, power for its own sake, coercion, fear. This is that intuitive understanding we all kind of get from those original films. Freedom versus tyranny, self-mastery versus coercive power. It's a very clear-cut articulation of these fundamental forces.
And the source connects this directly to how we might feel our Jedi senses tingling when public figures weaponize truth not to enlighten, but to control. That's a really pertinent analogy, isn't it? It's like an internal alarm bell for manipulation.
It is potent. It's about that visceral discomfort, that feeling when the narrative feels off. The source calls it a malicious code injected to force an outcome rather than to allow one to emerge.
Malicious code, like propaganda.
Essentially, yes. Using information not to illuminate, but to manipulate towards a predetermined end. In the original Star Wars narrative, the Jedi were meant to embody this truth-seeking, guiding force. Not coercion, but empowering individuals through understanding.
So when we see figures twisting facts, cherry-picking data.
Right. Selectively presenting information, using statistics to manipulate rather than inform, the source argues it resonates with that fundamental battle. Good aims to enlighten and empower choice. Evil aims to dominate by controlling the narrative. That Jedi senses tingling is presented as our innate resistance to being manipulated, our intuition saying, hang on, this isn't about truth, this is about control. It's a gut feeling that truth should liberate, not subjugate.
Okay, so Star Wars gives us this clear moral compass initially, but the mythology itself, the source argues, holds a more complex lesson about the decay of even good institutions. It points specifically to the prequel-era Jedi Order.
Yes, this is a really vital point because it sets the stage for the source's broader critique of our own institutions. The Jedi Order of the late Republic, remember, despite being the guardians of good, became, well, rigid, complacent, dogmatic.
How so? They seemed powerful.
Powerful, yes, but stagnant. The source draws a direct and pretty harsh comparison, calling them the Pharisees of their day.
Ouch. Like religious leaders who follow the letter but miss the spirit.
Exactly that. The analogy highlights how dogma, a strict adherence to rules and traditions without a living connection to their original spirit or purpose, can lead to, well, spiritual and intellectual blindness, and inability to adapt.
So what were they doing wrong?
The Jedi, in this era, started hoarding their knowledge, becoming insular, exclusive, thinking they had all the answers. They began passing judgment not to discern value, but to condemn. Less about fostering growth and wisdom, more about enforcing a narrow orthodoxy.
And this made them vulnerable. How does the source connect that stagnation to the rise of the Sith?
It argues their dogma blinded them. They were so caught up in their own institutional procedures, their perceived infallibility, their rigid interpretations of prophecy, that they completely missed the rising evil of Palpatine right under their noses. Their own system prevented them from seeing the truth.
So their very adherence to their established ways, even though those ways were originally good, made them vulnerable. That's a fascinating and cautionary point.
It is. And then, of course, there's this catastrophic turn it off and on again reset, Order 66, the tragic purge that nearly wiped them out.
You mean the source sees the purge as
Yeah.
necessary?
Necessary in a tragic sense. Not that the act itself was good, obviously, but that the institution had become so disconnected from its foundational purpose, wisdom, freedom, balance, that only a complete devastating dismantling could potentially pave the way for a reconnection to those vital principles later on.
So their own internal failures created the opening for the external threat.
That's the core lesson drawn here. Their intellectual arrogance, their institutional rigidity made them incapable of effectively countering the cunning, adaptable evil rising against them. It's a stark lesson. Even the guardians of merit, of excellence, can become derelict through stagnation, creating a vulnerability. They got too comfortable, mistook tradition for truth, and that made them fragile.
Okay, that sets up a crucial distinction. If the prequel showed this slow internal decay leading to vulnerability, the source claims the sequel trilogy, episodes 7, 8, and 9, represents something far more active, more sinister, a deliberate act of ideological demolition. That's a really strong accusation. How is that different from decay?
It's a critical distinction in the author's argument. The prequels, as we discussed, depicted the internal rot, the complacency that made the institution vulnerable. The sequels, however, are presented very differently. Not as natural evolution, not even as a misguided attempt to build, but as an active, intentional dismantling of the very heroic archetypes and foundational narrative that Star Wars established.
So not just falling apart, but being actively torn down.
That's the claim. The source states these films were not a retelling of the hero's journey. They were a poorly attempted destruction of it. The implication is the goal wasn't to build upon or even critique the existing myths constructively, but to actually tear it down, to clear the ground for a new message, a new ideology.
And the prime example given is Luke Skywalker. The source calls his portrayal character assassination. Now, for listeners who might not be deep Star Wars fans, can you quickly unpack why Luke's portrayal felt so jarring to many, and why the source sees it as active dismantling? We need to touch on the hero's journey concept here, right?
Absolutely. The hero's journey is key. It's this fundamental narrative pattern, identified by Joseph Campbell, found in myths and stories across cultures. The original Star Wars trilogy, episodes 4, 5, and 6, is arguably the most famous modern example.
Luke's story.
Luke's story, exactly. He's the quintessential hero on this journey. He starts as the innocent farm boy, gets the call to adventure from the droids and Obi-Wan. He initially refuses the call, wanting to stay home, finds a mentor in Obi-Wan and Yoda, crosses the threshold, leaving Tatooine.
Faces trials, allies, enemies.
Right. Numerous trials, the Death Star, Dagobah training, Cloud City. He undergoes a transformation, faces his ultimate abyss confronting Vader and the truth about his father, and ultimately achieves a kind of resurrection by redeeming Vader and facing the Emperor, not with hate, but with love and principle.
And crucially, his power was earned, right?
That's the key point the source emphasizes. His journey was one of slow, arduous accumulation of skill through trial, failure, and sacrifice. He earned his power, his wisdom, his heroic status. It wasn't handed to him. He struggled, he failed, he learned, he grew. He didn't just become a Jedi Master. He earned it, step by painful step. That's the meritocratic ideal embodied in narrative form.
Okay, so that's the classic hero's journey, Luke. How did the sequels portray him, leading to this character assassination claim?
The sequels, as the source argues, dismantle this archetype. They portray Luke Skywalker as a cynical, broken failure who contemplated murdering his nephew in his sleep.
Which was a huge shock for many fans.
A massive shock. And then he exiles himself, cutting himself off from the Force, essentially giving up on everything he fought for and represented. The source argues this was not character development, it was character assassination, a necessary first step in clearing the ground for a new ideology.
So not a believable evolution of the character, but an active negation.
That's the argument. It wasn't about showing a hero grapple with age or doubt in a way that felt true to his established character, but about actively negating his prior achievements, his moral core, making his earned heroism seem meaningless, maybe even foolish or toxic. It effectively tells the audience, this source suggests, that the archetypal hero who succeeds through effort, principle, and moral strength is no longer relevant or perhaps even desirable.
Okay, so destroying the established hero creates a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled by Rey, presented as the new kind of hero whose defining quality was not earned merit, but innate identity. This is where the argument really loops back hard to the merit versus identity core premise, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is the crux of the Star Wars analysis in the source. Rey is positioned as the antithesis to Luke's earned journey. While Luke's path was that slow, arduous accumulation, Rey, well, she's presented as having incredible force abilities and lightsaber skills almost instantly.
The critique often heard is she didn't really train for it.
Right. We see her wield a lightsaber with uncanny proficiency against Kylo Ren, a trained Force user, in her very first attempt. She performs complex Force powers like mind tricks effortlessly, masters abilities that took Luke years, all with very little visible struggle, instruction, or failure. Her prowess, the source argues, was presented as an inherent fact of her being, an inheritance.
Especially once her lineage is revealed.
Exactly. It's framed more as an inheritance, not an achievement earned through the trials of a hero's journey. The inferred message, the source claims, whether intended or not, was clear. The paramount quality of success and value is no longer meritocratic struggle, but the simple fact of one's identity. She is powerful because of who she is, her bloodline, her innate potential, not primarily because of what she has done or overcome to earn it.
And this point about inheritance versus achievement connects to a really profound historical echo the author highlights, right? The timing of the article written July 3rd, 2025, right before July 4th.
Yes, it's a very deliberate and powerful connection the author draws to underscore the perceived gravity of this cultural shift from merit back towards identity.
How so? What's the connection to July 4th?
The source emphasizes that the United States, whose founding is commemorated on July 4th, was itself founded in violent, principled opposition to this very idea, the idea that inherent identity dictates worth or position.
Opposition to European systems.
Exactly. The American Revolution was framed as a rebellion against the identity-wielding rulers of Europe who claimed power based on their heraldic identity, their bloodlines, and their historical class. Monarchy, aristocracy, inherited titles. These were systems built entirely on identity. Your destiny, your power, your place was dictated by who your parents were, your birthright, not by your actions or abilities.
So the American experiment, then, was fundamentally a fight against that kind of identity-based system, against the tyranny of identitarians, as the source puts it.
Precisely. It was presented as a radical departure, a revolutionary ideal, a fight for the lived truth of the weak, the oppressed, and those yearning to be free. It championed this radical proposition that one's destiny should not be dictated by one's birth, but by one's deeds.
The opportunity to prove yourself.
Exactly. The opportunity to prove oneself through a unique hero's journey, where what you achieve through hard work, ingenuity, moral character could determine your worth and place. Creating a system where individual merit, theoretically, could elevate you, regardless of background. The source argues this core American ideal, the meritocratic promise, is precisely what is being dismantled by a generation of modern writers who perhaps so devoid of the ability to build upon this legacy, decided it was easier to declare it toxic and erase it.
That is a heavy indictment, essentially accusing cultural creators of undermining the nation's founding principles by changing the stories we tell, replacing their earned journey with inherent
It's a
status.
very strong claim, yes,
Yeah.
that they're actively dismantling the very narratives that underpin those principles.
Wow. It really forces you to think, doesn't it? How this shift in narrative from heroes who earn their stripes to heroes who are just sort of inherently powerful or important because of who they are, how might that influence broader societal values? If our biggest stories stop emphasizing struggle, effort, earning your place, what message does that send?
Well, the potential message, subtle but profound, is that innate qualities, or perhaps the identity group you belong to, are more important determinants of success or worth than individual effort, resilience, or personal growth through overcoming challenges.
So why bother with the hard journey?
Exactly. If success is just an inheritance or an inherent fact of your being, then the incentive to embark on your own arduous hero's journey, to acquire skills, face failures, make sacrifices, that incentive could be dramatically diminished. Why strive if your destiny or value is already perceived as fixed by birth or identity?
It could reshape expectations, couldn't it? About work, about challenge, about responsibility.
It could. It might foster a sense of entitlement, perhaps, or a view of status as something passively received rather than actively earned. And that has potentially widespread implications for how individuals approach their lives, how society values contributions, and even how we approach collective problem solving. If the path of merit, of demonstrable competence through effort, is deemed less important or even toxic, then the very engine of innovation and progress could, theoretically, sputter.
Okay, so the source uses Star Wars as this powerful cultural case study, but it doesn't stop there. It quickly bridges this narrative deconstruction to the real world political landscape, from local school boards to the highest branches of government. How does the disruption of the hero's journey manifest politically, according to this analysis?
The source argues that the same kind of derision we feel for a hollowed-out myth can be applied to politicians who are perceived as seeking to wield force not by merit but by identity.
Meaning, how does that play out?
Just as Luke's earned heroism was allegedly dismantled in the narrative, the political sphere sees, according to the source, a widespread delegitimization of foundational principles and historical figures,
Attacking the past.
but not just critiquing it. The argument is that this isn't about nuanced historical understanding, which is obviously vital for growth. Instead, the goal is presented as not a nuanced understanding of flawed men and women, but a wholesale demolition of their legacy to justify a year zero reset.
Year zero, like wiping the slate clean.
Exactly. That phrase implies a complete rejection of the past, an attempt to erase history and start entirely anew, often without a clear, merit-based plan for what comes next. It's framed as a strategy of demolition, rejecting historical figures and foundational principles by declaring them irredeemably flawed, perhaps simply by association with the past or a dominant group.
So the philosophy of let the past die, which was literally Kylo Ren's line in the sequel trilogy,
Yeah.
has, as the source chillingly puts it, escaped the screen and now echoes in the chambers of power. That's a direct link from fiction to political strategy.
It is a direct link the source makes. It suggests that what might have started as a creative choice in a fictional story had become a kind of guiding principle in political action and public discourse. Not healthy critique or reform, but tearing down existing structures, narratives, even historical reputations, without necessarily having a solid, merit-based alternative ready to build in their place.
And if you declare the past inherently toxic,
Then the argument follows that you can't learn from it. You can only reject it entirely. Burn it down, start from scratch, which, the source implies, carries enormous risks for societal stability and progress.
and this demolition strategy leads directly to what the source calls identity as a political strategy, where the primacy of identity over merit becomes the chief strategy of political engagement. Why is an argument from identity described as a fortress? How does it differ from arguing based on merit?
Okay, so an argument for merit, as the source defines it, is one based on data, logic, and a track record of competence. Things you can actually point to and measure, at least in theory.
Things that can be debated.
Exactly, they can be debated and improved. If you propose a policy based on its projected economic benefits or support a candidate based on their proven management skills, those claims can be scrutinized. People can bring counter data, challenge the logic, look at the track record. It encourages, ideally, an open discussion where the best ideas, regardless of who suggests them, can win out based on evidence and reason.
Okay, that's the ideal for merit-based argument. But an argument from identity.
Fundamentally different, according to this view. The source calls it a fortress because it claims it deflects any and all criticism as an attack on personhood, on a group, on an entire class of people.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a debate about, say, a new education curriculum. Traditionally, you might discuss its effectiveness, its factual accuracy, pedagogical methods, student outcomes. But what if one side argues the curriculum is inherently good because it centers the perspective of a specific identity group and declares that any questioning of the curriculum is therefore an attack on that group?
So the criticism isn't about the curriculum's merits anymore.
Precisely. Your criticism gets deflected. It's reinterpreted not as a substantive critique of the idea or policy, but as an ad hominem attack on the identity associated with it.
So you can't even engage with the substance.
It becomes extremely difficult. The source calls it a conversation-ending tactic that is brutally effective. Instead of engaging in that open field of democratic deliberation where ideas compete on merit, it creates a series of fortified camps, each with its own political truth.
Fortified camps, that sounds like polarization.
It fuels it, certainly. Genuine dialogue becomes incredibly hard, maybe impossible. If challenging an idea is automatically framed as a personal or group attack, then questioning itself becomes taboo. It stifles dissent, discourages independent thinking, makes it nearly impossible to find common ground or compromise, because facts and logic get shoved aside in favor of group affiliation.
And the source takes this even further, stating that even trying to verify any of this, to establish ground truth through a system more reliable than the curated results of political polling, is itself decried as an attack on the system. What does that mean for finding objective truth?
It implies a really profound erosion of shared reality, a crisis in epistemology, like how do we even know what's true anymore? If objective data, logical reasoning, independent verification, historical evidence, if all these tools for finding ground truth are dismissed as inherently biased or as attacks on the system or tools of oppression,
Then what's left?
then there's no common ground for determining truth. The source compares relying only on things like political polling to asking a few blind men to describe an elephant. It gives you an incomplete, possibly misleading picture, easily manipulated. When arguments from identity become essentially unchallengeable and the very pursuit of objective ground truth is resisted or attacked,
Democratic discourse just breaks down.
it suffers immensely. It hinders our collective ability to identify problems accurately, analyze potential solutions based on evidence, and adapt based on what actually works in reality. It fragments society into these self-validating echo chambers, making it incredibly difficult to achieve consensus or make collective progress on complex issues that really demand shared understanding. We risk ending up in a place where facts are just dismissed if they don't fit the preferred narrative.
That sounds like a genuine crisis, a crisis of shared reality. Now, the source shifts focus again to what it calls the most tragic manifestation of this whole pathology, the modern academy. Why academia? Why is the shift there seen as particularly tragic?
It's framed as tragic because, as the source puts it, the academy's sole purpose is the cultivation of the mind. It's supposed to be the bastion of objective truth, rigorous inquiry, critical thinking, intellectual development. The place where meritocracy, in theory, should reign supreme, where the best ideas, the most robust research, the most insightful scholarship rise to the top based on their quality.
But the source claims that's not happening.
It claims the opposite is happening. That in academia, these legacy principles, objective truth, rigorous learning, meritocratic achievement, and excellence, are themselves increasingly framed as toxic relics of an oppressive past.
Toxic. The pursuit of truth is toxic.
That's the charge. That these core academic values are being reframed as inherently problematic, perhaps because they are associated with historical power structures or seen as obstacles to achieving certain social justice outcomes centered on identity. If that's true, the source argues, it's a fundamental betrayal of the academy's entire purpose. It's like a hospital declaring health itself a symptom of disease.
Okay, so if those traditional virtues are being discarded as toxic, what replaces them within the academy, according to the source? What are the new virtues?
The source identifies three primary replacements. First, identity becomes the lens through which all knowledge must be filtered.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that understanding or evaluating any subject, history, literature, science, philosophy, must primarily be viewed through the framework of identity groups, power dynamics, historical oppression related to those groups. The focus shifts from seeking universal truths or objective discoveries to analyzing how knowledge impacts or is interpreted by specific identity categories.
So a scientific finding might be judged not just on its data, but on its perceived social implications for certain groups.
That's the kind of shift implied, yes. The social or political lens becomes primary.
Okay, that's identity. What else?
Second, conformity. Conformity to the prevailing ideological orthodoxy becomes paramount,
Meaning you have to toe the line.
essentially. Intellectual dissent, challenging the established narratives within this new identity-focused framework, is actively discouraged, maybe even penalized. Scholars or students who offer alternative viewpoints or who try to analyze subjects outside the prescribed identity lens might face, ostracism, professional setbacks, social shaming. It creates a chilling effect on open inquiry,
And the third new virtue.
stagnation, which the source sees as the inevitable result of a system without intellectual competition. If ideas aren't rigorously debated, challenged, tested against meritocratic standards, if the main goal becomes ideological alignment rather than the pursuit of truth, then real intellectual advancement slows down or stops.
So the academy risks becoming less about education, more about indoctrination.
That's the danger highlighted, producing predictable thought that fits the orthodoxy, rather than fostering the kind of groundbreaking insight that comes from challenging assumptions and open debate.
That sounds like a recipe for intellectual paralysis, really. Forgetting the whole point of a university. And these consequences, this institutional navel-gazing, they don't just stay on campus, do they? The source says the academy's product is graduates. What does this mean for young people entering the world?
Right, the effects ripple outwards. The source argues the academy's failure is measured in the collision between its teachings and the unyielding feedback loop of reality.
The feedback loop of reality, like the real world.
Exactly. While students might be instilled with this unshakable sense of ideological certainty on campus, strong convictions about identity, conformity, maybe social justice defined in a particular way, the world outside academia often operates on different principles. They emerge, the source claims, unequipped with the practical skills to find meaningful employment.
So if academic success was more about ideological alignment than, say, demonstrable competence or critical thinking skills,
Then graduates might find their degrees are devalued in a job market that still largely runs on merit, on what you can actually do, what problems can you solve, what value can you create.
so they might enter the real world armed with certainty, but maybe not the actual skills to back it up or succeed economically.
That's the picture painted. Generations of young people emerging from these institutions who then discover that their education hasn't necessarily prepared them for the demands of a competitive global economy. And meanwhile, the source adds, the reality of their crippling debt is all too real.
Oh, wow. That's a tough combination. Debt and lack of practical skills.
It leads to what the source calls a tragic irony. The final lesson in the new curriculum is that the real world does not grade on a curve. In academia, there might be allowances, ideological shields, a focus on abstract theory that could obscure real-world performance deficits. But the market, life itself, tends to provide pretty direct, unvarnished feedback on actual capabilities.
And that disillusionment must be huge. For the individual and for society, if a large part of the educated population isn't equipped to contribute effectively.
It impacts individual careers, absolutely, but it also potentially undermines the societal contribution. Education is supposed to foster innovation, problem-solving, economic productivity. It challenges the very idea of education as a reliable pathway to competence and meaningful contribution.
Okay, so after laying out this really quite bleak, disturbing diagnosis across culture, politics, and academia, the source does turn towards a path forward, a reclaiming the hero's journey. It starts by summarizing the pattern it sees.
Yes, it ties it all together neatly, highlighting what it sees as the consistent pattern across all three domains, a flight from the difficult responsibilities of merit and a retreat into the false certainty of identity.
A flight from responsibility, retreat into certainty.
Right, and it frames this not just as a political trend, but as something deeper, a philosophical surrender, a declaration of bankruptcy from a class of leaders who, unable or unwilling to engage in the hard work of building, have taken up the easier task of demolition.
Easier to tear down than to build.
That's the implication. Dismantling might feel easier, especially when the commitment to merit, which requires tough decisions, objective evaluation, being judged on outcomes, is abandoned for the seemingly easier, less challengeable path of identity, where your status or claims might feel beyond reproach simply based on who you are.
But the path forward, this is important. It isn't about a blind return to a flawless past, is it? The source brings back the Jedi lesson here.
Crucially, yes. It explicitly states, for no such thing exists. Remember the Jedi. In their hubris and rigidity, they became blind, requiring that catastrophic reset. So the lesson isn't to pine for some mythical perfect past, because there wasn't one.
We shouldn't just try to perfectly replicate old institutions.
No. It's about learning from past mistakes, acknowledging the flaws in historical institutions and figures, while still upholding the foundational principles that were valuable. It's about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you could say, recovering the spirit of merit and excellence, not necessarily just the rigid, flawed forms of the past.
Okay, so it requires us to revalue the hero's journey, but not as a dusty myth, but as the fundamental process of human and societal improvement. How does the source make that ancient concept feel relevant right now? How does it break it down for us?
It breaks it down on two levels. For the individual, the hero's journey is described as the journey through trial and error to acquire skills and wisdom. It's about personal growth, right? Learning from mistakes, facing challenges head-on, earning competence through lived experience and disciplined effort. It's the active pursuit of mastery, of becoming better.
And for society?
For society, the hero's journey is framed as the journey of a society to solve problems through open debate and a relentless meritocratic search for the best ideas, regardless of their origin.
Regardless of origin, meaning not based on identity.
Exactly. It means valuing open discourse where ideas are judged on their effectiveness, their soundness, their evidence, rather than who proposes them or what group they might represent. It's about a collective pursuit of truth and effective solutions, a society-wide commitment to continuous improvement based on what genuinely works, discovered through open competition of ideas.
And the actionable insight it offers is quite direct. Turn off the noise of the daily spectacle, to filter out the high-frequency outrage, and to sense the deeper signal. What is that deeper signal telling us, according to the source, beyond the day-to-day headlines?
That deeper signal is pointing back to the core diagnosis we started with. Our core institutions are failing in their primary duty.
Failing how?
Failing to create competent citizens, to tell meaningful stories, and to govern wisely. It's a call to look beneath the surface conflicts, the endless political fights and cultural battles you see online, and identify the underlying systemic issue, this alleged abandonment of merit in favor of identity.
So, recognize the symptoms are coming from a deeper problem.
That's the idea. Recognizing that the frustrations, the sense that things are off, might stem from this more fundamental pathology within our foundational structures. And seeing that requires a certain level of discernment, a refusal to be constantly swayed by superficial arguments or outrage, and a commitment to seeking objective reality, however difficult that might be.
Which brings us to the final challenge. The source presents reversing this trend as the defining challenge of our time, and it's framed as a battle.
Yes, quite explicitly, an epic battle we are now in.
Yeah.
This framed the current societal dynamics not just as disagreements, but as a fundamental struggle over core values, over the very operating system of our society.
And how should this battle be fought?
Crucially, the source argues it must be fought not with the weapon of identity, but with the enduring power of merit, excellence, and the defiant pursuit of truth.
So, fighting the focus on identity by refocusing on merit and truth.
Exactly. It's presented as a call to re-engage with the principles that, the source argues, built and sustain functional institutions. Demonstrated ability, high standards, an unwavering commitment to objective reality, and the willingness to accept an idea based on its validity, not its source. It's definitely a challenging path, but presented as ultimately hopeful a way towards rebuilding based on genuine achievement and shared understanding. It urges us to choose the hard, rewarding path of the hero's journey over what it portrays as the deceptive ease of identity politics.
And that really brings us to the end of today's deep dive. We've spent this time exploring the central tension that William L. Weaver illuminates in The Unbecoming, this critical shift, or perceived shift, from valuing merit to prioritizing identity within our key institutions. And we looked at its profound implications across culture, government, and academia.
We did, using the really rich narrative of Star Wars as a lens, didn't we? To understand this complex shift from that internal decay we saw in the prequel-era Jedi.
Right, the stagnation.
To what the source describes as the ideological demolition in the sequels, particularly around figures like Luke and Rey, and then connecting those story dynamics to the very real-world challenges discussed in politics and education.
It's definitely a challenging diagnosis to consider, but maybe also a call to action, or at least reflection, for each of us listening.
Indeed. And maybe as you go about your day after listening to this, we invite you to consider this question. Where do you see the hero's journey? That path of earned achievement through struggle being celebrated or perhaps undermined in the stories you consume, the institutions you interact with, or even maybe in your own personal aspirations.
That's a great question. And maybe following on that, what actions or shifts, even small ones, might promote merit, excellence, and that defiant pursuit of truth in your own sphere, in your work, your community, your family?
Yeah, keep sensing for that deeper signal the author talks about, beneath the daily noise. Reflect on the enduring power of merit versus what the source calls the seductive pull of identity.
We really hope this deep dive has given you some new tools, some new ways to think about what might be unfolding around us, and maybe help you navigate a world that seems to be grappling intensely with these profound shifts. Thanks so much for joining us.